72 minutes. You go through this in the book almost minute by minute, showing exactly what will happen. We know in those first couple of minutes there's a notification that there's a nuclear bomb coming in from somewhere. My question on that was, and I was thinking about this earlier as we were talking about it, how does the president know? How does the world leader of that country know, the prime minister of the UK, whoever it might be, or Netanyahu or Putin, know where that nuclear bomb has come from? Because we talked about this sort of black book of places, this menu that the president has in that football that his aide is carrying around. How does he know which place to pick on the menu to send a nuclear bomb?
You're absolutely right that there is no way of knowing. And in the scenario that I chose, because I wanted to try to take the reader through a logical sequence, if you could even call any of this logical, because it's all, they call it MAD, mutual assured destruction. It's really madness. But you cannot know who launched that.
So we just go for our enemy in that situation?
I mean,
do you know what I mean? Because that's what I do.
Now you have a new task. You are going to write nuclear war, an even worse scenario.
Well, because that's what you would do, right? If you're President Biden, your aide turns to you and goes, "Hi, President, there's a nuclear bomb heading our way." I go, "I know exactly who did that." and you might start firing a couple of back at just the people that you assume would do it.
Everyone is working on figuring out the trajectory of the ballistic missile. And there is the first confirmation when you see it. And by the way, a ballistic missile cannot be redirected. Wait a minute. Would the president be staying at the White House? So I, as the reporter, put that question to the former director of the Secret Service, who explains to me how there is a team called the Counter Assault Team. And that is the sort of paramilitary organization of the Secret Service that's going to always be there to move the president really fast. No matter how nuclear war begins, it ends in 72 minutes and 5 billion people would be dead.
Do you think there will be a nuclear war?
So I've interviewed former secretaries of defense, the former nuclear sub-commander, the Secret Service. And what I learned was, oh my God.
Annie Jacobsen, investigative researcher and writer who specializes in uncovering the world's biggest secrets.
We are one misunderstanding away from nuclear apocalypse. And yet you have presidents threatening nuclear war. In fact, the president of the United States doesn't need to ask anyone to launch a nuclear missile.
It makes me realize how important the decision to pick our leaders is.
Nothing could be more important.
Could you play out a scenario where nuclear war broke out?
Yes, and I can describe in painstaking, horrific detail precisely what happens. But after nuclear war, the survivors would be forced to live underground and envy the dead.
Annie, is there anyone you interviewed that brought you to tears?
Yes. I met a woman who is a survivor of the Nagasaki bomb. And I haven't written about this yet. But someone I interviewed and someone that meant a lot to me wired that nuclear weapon that was dropped on Nagasaki.
Can you speak about the impact that it had on both those individuals?
And it's horrifying. Okay. So those numbers. The U.S. has an interceptor program to allegedly intercept a long-range ballistic missile. I'm not talking about short range or even medium range, long range, like that would come from Russia or North Korea. We have 44 interceptor missiles. 4 of them are at Vandenberg Air Force Base in Santa Barbara. 40 of them are at Fort Greely in Alaska. 44. So if Russia has 1,670 nuclear weapons, how are our 44 interceptors going to go up against those? And that says nothing, by the way, and I get into this in sort of the little bit of the wonkiness. Inside a nuclear warhead, many of them are what are called MIRVed, which means they have multiple warheads inside of it. And so when the warhead unleashes, the multiple warheads go out along with decoys so that if an interceptor missile is coming at it, it greatly reduces the chance that the interceptor will be able to shoot it out of the sky. The way that it was said to me was like this. An interceptor missile, which is basically just like a small ICBM, right? It's a rocket. It is like trying to shoot a bullet with a bullet. That's a quote from the spokesperson at the Pentagon. One of them is traveling at 14,000 miles an hour, the ballistic missile, 14,000 miles an hour. The interceptor, the little kinetic vehicle inside of it that's going to hit the warhead, hopefully, is traveling at 20,000 miles an hour. That's where you get the trying to hit a bullet with a bullet. And by the way, this is all happening 500 miles up in space. Good luck. The success rate of our interceptor program is between 40 and 55%. That's on a good day where they're testing these things and they go, hey, we're doing an interceptor test. It might be around there, right? That's called a curated test. That's not in the madness of the moment.
The bombs land. If I was a fly on the wall, not that there would be a wall left, what would I, and I was looking at America or the UK after it had been struck by these nuclear bombs, by thousands of, Russian or North Korean nuclear weapons, what would I see? What would the visuals be in those minutes after the strike?
I describe the first bomb in the scenario that strikes the Pentagon. It's a 1 megaton thermonuclear bomb in painstaking, horrific detail, all sourced from Defense Department documents, defense scientists who have worked for decades to describe precisely what happens to things and to humans. And it's horrifying. But on top of the initial flash of thermonuclear light, which is 180 million degrees, which catches everything on fire in a 9-mile diameter radius. On top of the bulldozing effect of the wind and all the buildings coming down, and more fires igniting more fires, on top of the radiation poisoning people to death in minutes and hours and days and weeks, if they happen to have survived. On top of all of that, each one of these fires creates a mega fire that is 100 or more square miles. And so essentially, in essence, what do you see? Well, in the scenario at minute 72, 1,000 Russian nuclear weapons land on the United States. And so it just becomes a conflagration of fire. It's just fire, fires burning, fires, 100, 200 square mile fires burning. And then we move into nuclear winter. And that's sort of the denouement of the book, where I tell you about nuclear winter from the point of view of one of the original scientists who wrote that original nuclear winter paper with Carl Sagan back in 1983. And his name is Professor Brian Toon. And he spent the decades since working with the state-of-the-art climate modeling systems that can now precisely tell us what nuclear winter will look like.
Because I've always thought, nuclear war wouldn't be that bad. If, Russia launched 1,000 of their nuclear bombs at the United States and I was here in New York where I am now, I would die instantly, so I wouldn't really know it happened. Is that true?
I think you would want to die instantly. I mean, there's a quote from Nikita Khrushchev, the former premier of the Soviet Union, and he said, after nuclear war, the survivors would envy the dead. Because there is, right? There is this sense of if you survived, there is no more law and order. There is no more rule of law. There is no government. Craig Fugate made that very clear. The bunkers that the people in the military command and control centers would be in, let's say the secret bunkers, not the ones that are targets that Russia's going to take out, that I write about in the book, but the smaller ones, those are going to only function for as long as there's gasoline to run the diesel generators. And then those people are going to have to come out. And who's left? It's man returning to the most primal, most violent state as people fight over the tiny resources that remain. And by the way, they're all malnourished, everybody's sick, and most people have lost everything and everyone they know. How's that going to feel?
It's going to feel, as you describe here on page 277, there are 1,000 flashes of light superheating the air in each ground zero to 180 million degrees Fahrenheit, 1,000 fireballs, each more than a mile in diameter, 1,000 steeply fronted blast waves, 1,000 walls of compressed air, 1,000 American cities and towns where all engineered structures in 5, 6, or 7 miles radius change physical shapes, collapse and burn. 1,000 cities and towns with molten asphalt streets, 1,000 cities and towns with survivors impaled to death by flying debris, 1,000 cities and towns filled with tens of millions of dead people, with tens of millions of unfortunate survivors suffering fatal third-degree burns, people naked, tattered, bleeding, and suffocating, people who don't look or act like people anymore. Across America and Europe, hundreds of millions of people are dead and dying, while hundreds of military aircraft fly circles in the air until they run out of fuel. I mean, that is some visual. How many people would be dead or dying, do you think, after those 72 minutes?
Hundreds of millions of people die in the fireballs, no question. But the number that I think is very interesting to think about comes from Professor Toon and his team, who wrote a paper for Nature recently, 2022, and sort of updated nuclear winter idea based around food. And the number that they have is 5 billion people would be dead.
The population of the planet currently is what, 8 billion?
Yes.
So there'd be 3 billion people still alive. Where shall I go to be one of the 3 billion? I was just in New Zealand and Australia.
That's exactly where you'd go. Although,
Good.
according to Toon,
I'm
those
going
are the
back on
only
tour.
places that could actually sustain agriculture.
I was there 2 weeks ago. Not even 2 weeks ago. It was maybe 10 days ago. I was in New Zealand and Australia. And at that time, I think Iran attacked Israel.
Yes.
I was kind of happy.
You were in the right place at the right time.
I was
Yes.
kind of happy for where I was located. If I'm gonna, and I was thinking, I actually remember I was talking to my friends and I pulled up a map. I was trying to see how far away I was from everything. I was thinking because World War III started trending on Twitter, I was thinking if it does break out now, I think I'm probably pretty well placed. Is that the place to be? Do you think?
That is, according to Professor Toon. I mean, he was so generous with me. He shared a lot of his slideshows that he has for his students. And that is really pretty much what's left. I mean, because most of the world is, certainly the mid-latitudes would be covered in these, sheets of ice, the freshwater bodies. Places like Iowa and Ukraine would be just snow for 10 years. And so agriculture would fail. And when agriculture fails, people just die. And on top of that, you have the radiation poisoning, because the ozone layer will be so damaged and destroyed that you can't be outside in the sunlight. And so people will be forced to live underground. And so you have to imagine people living underground, fighting for food, everywhere except for in New Zealand and Australia. There was also another interesting detail that he shared with me, that, 66 million years ago, an asteroid hit Earth and wiped out the dinosaurs and something like 70% of the known species. And Professor Toon compared nuclear war to that situation. And so when you really think about it, and again, this was also echoed by Craig Fugate, FEMA's director, you think about it, there's nothing we can do about an asteroid, at least not right now. And yet there is something, Kit. Nuclear war is a man-made threat. And therefore, it has to be a man-made solution.
What is the solution?
I really believe that people motivate other people. It's like a fundamental truth on the smallest scale and on the biggest scale. And so there's one person who is incredibly powerful, and that is the President of the United States. For better or for worse, it's just the way it is. And so in the same way that the president has presidential sole authority to start a nuclear war, the president also has a very powerful pen with which he can write executive orders, an EO. And the story I tell on the hopeful note goes like this. When I was in high school in 1983, there was an ABC TV movie called The Day After. And it showed a fictional war between the United States and then Soviet Russia. It was horrific and terrifying, okay? 100 million Americans watched it. 100 million Americans. It was like the third of the population. And I think it was half the population then. President Reagan was one of those Americans. He had a private screening at Camp David. His advisors told him not to watch it. He did watch it. Before that, President Reagan was a hawk. He was pro-nuclear weapons. His position was the more nuclear weapons, the better. He was the one putting nuclear weapons in space with the Star Wars program, the SDI program, okay? He couldn't have been more pro-deterrence supremacy. He saw the day after, and he changed his position. He wrote in his White House journal that he became greatly depressed. His words. And he reached out to Gorbachev. And then they had a Reykjavik summit, a summit in Iceland, Reagan and Gorbachev. And through communication, right? Through both of them realizing this is madness, realizing what could happen, seeing the day after and realizing, my God, this cannot happen. And they famously issued a statement that said, the joint statement between the two of them said, a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. And the result of the Reykjavik summit was that the world has gone from 70,000 nuclear warheads. That was the all-time high. 70,000. Why do you need 70,000 nuclear warheads? That's what there were in 1986. And now, here we are, because of the reductions, because of the treaties, thanks to those two, 12,500 approximately nuclear warheads. That is the movement in the right direction. And it came from a dramatic story being told, and it came from the president taking action because people would not stand for this anymore. There were massive protests.
Do you believe we could ever get to zero? Honestly.
That is for the disarmament experts. I like to stay in my lane as a storyteller, as an investigative journalist. I like to give you the dramatic, fast read, and then pass the baton to those who have been working on that issue for decades, because boy, are they qualified. I just had the great fortune of being invited to Brussels, where I was part of a nuclear expo, and there were members of the European Parliament in the audience. And there were all these disarmament people there, and I learned a lot about all of these groups. And they have the answer, and they are the ones that should be asked that question, and they are doing a lot to get us there.
From the moment you wrote the first word in this new book, Nuclear War: A Scenario, to when you finished the book, how did your feelings change about the subject matter?
It's interesting because you write this is just my experience as a journalist, but you write the book, and you're like any professional person, you want to do a really good job at your job, right? So I was very focused on gathering the facts and then relaying them in a readable way. You know, my husband, Kevin, always says, like, you got to write something that someone can read on the beach or an airplane, right? Which is not necessarily conducive to like Nazi scientists or the other things I've written about. But for this, it became clear to me, nuclear launch to nuclear winter fast. Have people read it fast because you want to grab their attention, because I'm a mother, you know. I'm a hopeful person that believes that we do not have to live with this threat overhead. And so my focus of the work was really on doing the best job I could to narrate the story. And I think you take your hat off about maybe any more sort of emotional or sentimental feelings. You try to push that into the prose, I suppose. So maybe in subtext, there is a sense of urgency and even fear. But for me, intellectually, you know, as an investigative journalist, it was just what's the next page going to read like?